All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Badger Office Hours. We are going to be spending this time doing a bit of a working council session because the an important bit 93 has gone through, which gives a lot of which basically restructures the way the council is involved in the whole bit process, and as an extension the overall Badger governance process. So that is what we're going to be going over today. And if we have some extra time, we're going to go into what we kind of think are the most important issues that are going to be on the governance plate for the next 3 6 months, something like that. Again, this is recorded and this will be posted on our channels. And if you're interested in engaging more on Badger governance, just head over to the council section of our Discord. So let's see. Freddie is not here, but does anyone want to just get us started with an overview of BIP 93 and what the kind of like main considerations were in getting that through?
Well, yeah, I can start with I think the key point is like what are we trying to solve with governance 2.0, and I think a lot of community members were frustrated and have been frustrated when it comes to getting BIPs passed through. And just in case somebody listening is like new to this whole thing, BIPs are Badger improvement proposals, not can be confused with Biden's improvement proposals. They are essentially core to why you hold the Badger token, so that you can vote on and help steer the DAO in different directions. Hopefully the most profitable direction for token holders and the whole DAO in general. And yeah, there's just been a couple of things that have come through that have been proven contentious, and then there's just not a really strong, clear process on like who has the power to actually get the BIPs going. And anyone that wants to can write them out, but then how do you actually bring it to the community? How do you stop there being too much noise in the community? And assure that all these BIPs are high quality and things that we actually need to be voting on. And then there's been pressure from large token holders and large depositors that sort of like force BIPs through it. So then it felt to everyone um, pretty unfair that they have that power and regular community members don't. So yeah, the whole point of this step in governance, by empowering the council to sort of be the gatekeepers around BIPs, and gatekeepers around the team itself too, because a lot of the BIPs have just come right out of the team, where this is sort of shifting the power to say, okay, the council is actually going to be from start to finish the ones who get to make the decision of what gets to make it into the forum, what gets to be voted on, and so forth. And then the other thing that they're going to be trying to do is increase the quality of the BIPs, right? Make sure that they're meeting a format, and they're not just like low effort proposals. So yeah, I think that's a bit of the summary around why we're trying to do this.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would add to that is there's something around governance process, right? So right now, like we have kind of a process that we follow that is like documented in various different places, but like it oftentimes we run into situations where there's not clarity. So I think the other thing that the council is there to do is just generally focus on governance process, right? And make our entire governance process run smoothly, make it be standard, make sure that like how it works is well documented and that everybody's able to engage with it. Right? I think that's like the first step. And then like the other thing that's happening already and has been for a long time is that the reality is that there's a number of decisions that the team doesn't feel like we should make, right, around the token or around various different things. Um, and we also, based on like, the 100 VIPs that we've done, it's clear that like there's a lot of things, a lot of those things the token holders don't want to actually weigh in on, right? It's like too minor to go try to ask all of the Badger holders and get like a significant response that's like representative. Um, and it's too major for the team to just say like, okay, we're going to do this. So I think the other thing that like the council kind of has been doing is like we've been going to them and asking them to make small decisions or things that we don't think fit into a BIP and we don't think the team should make. And that's still not super written into governance. So I think like the other thing that I'm challenging and hope that the council will do over the next few months is like think about a little bit where those boundaries are, right? And think about like the governance process not only as being a council that is facilitating token holder voting and that whole process, but also is kind of facilitating generally making governance decisions and deciding like what the right body is to deal with that, and trying to get to the point where when decisions are being made, they're being made by, unless they're big, or it always, I guess, that like there's groups of people that are focused on it, that understand the subject matter, that are spending time on it, that are deciding how it should be decided, right? That's being validated against a set of rules, and then like that the governance that's being executed is being done in a sensible way that provides like the right level of transparency and input to everyone involved. And I think that is the big governance challenge, right? And I think this is an opportunity or an attempt to bring a group of people together to try to take a stab at making progress there.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. From my point of view, you can also chunk it up to think about what are you actually trying to accomplish with a DAO, right? And that's decentralization. So then you think about, well, what is decentralization? How is it actually measured, right? What's some sort of spectrum to show that over time it's becoming more permissionless, control and influence is progressing more and more. And then you can start to think about, well, what elements of a DAO has to be a little bit more centralized versus partially versus fully, and then what are the components of that over time. So I think to your point, Trit, on how decisions are made, it's complex. There's a variety of different bodies, a variety of different decisions that have to be made. And even though all BIPs are, just presented to the community to be voted on, it's up to the community to figure out the importance of those BIPs, right? And there's no like cherry picking that. That's just the reality of how there has to be some work done on how decisions are made. What are they actually trying to accomplish? And I think governance 2.0 passing is going to allow that to be, thought through from top to bottom. And when I think about decentralization, there's been a lot of work that's been done on trying to figure out what are the components of decentralization, right? And I've got to a point in my mind, and through doing some research and collaboration across the community and with like different lawyers and stuff like that, where it really comes down to a few basic elements. So things like mind and management, right? The business thinking that goes into the protocol. Economic control. What's the reality of the tokenomics and how money is made? What's the reality of technological control, right? How can you make that more and more permissionless in the way that the technology fulfills the strategy? And then to think about information transparency, right? And continuing to have that available for everybody. And then the last thing is custody and continuing to be non-custodial. With all the stuff that's been going down in the market in the last few weeks, I think everybody can see the reality of how custody is a big part of decentralization and giving token holders control of their own assets. So yeah, those are a few things from my point of view that I think this will help to tackle, is really just leaning into thinking about what is decentralization, how is it, measured and enabled through the council and through all the participating token holders and contributors.
And just to add to that, Lip, on the custody note, right, particularly around custodial, right, I think the other thing that is incredibly important, right, and I don't know like when it will become legally significant, but in all of this is that like is transparency, right? Like you have to be able to see what is happening in order to like know that it is non-custodial, right? And so a lot of that is in my mind about like the transparency about the decisions being made, right? And from a real decentralized point of view, we've made incredible steps there because our multi-sig repo is now public. Basically every on-chain thing that the DAO does is there's a public ticket, people can see it, all of the code is there, there's a bot that's tweeting it, like we've had community members like come and like ask us questions about a specific like multi-sig transaction like while it was in the process of being reviewed. So like we've done a really good job of providing like really full transparency to people that want to like look into it and really, really are super engaged and want to take the time to understand. But I think there's still an opportunity, and we're moving towards it with like posting more to the forum, and again, like with process of like really thinking about like what is a decision and how does every decision that we make, no matter like where it's getting made, right? Like how does that get communicated out to the community, and like when and why. And yeah, in my view, like everything should eventually come out, right? And that's something that we can also work on, and that, you know, combined with custody and everything that Lip is talking about, really like completes the decentralized vision.
Yeah, and I do want to take a step back because you know, the name of this call is not, you know, BIP 93, it's governance 2.0. And you know, I see a lot of criticism, especially on you know, crypto Twitter, about how DAOs are, you know, these dysfunctional bodies that can never scale and never work. And I would push back on that a lot because you know, one of the things we've been doing at Badger that I think has been really successful is creating, you know, these non-hierarchical power groups. And so for instance, like, you know, we passed this BIP just, you know, in April, that was creating this Treasury Council, right? And so in my mind, that was a big step towards governance 2.0, right? It's taking away, you know, the responsibility from the token holders and from the core team, and creating a separate governing body around just managing, you know, the DAO's treasury assets. And so I really do think, like, you know, if you go through like decentralization, you think about that, and then you think, okay, well, how do we keep things actually working and not have decentralization be a problem? Then you really do need, instead of just a DAO with a bunch of token holders voting, you need a bunch of separate groups with a bunch of checks and balances, right? So having the core team be focused on building, having the treasury team be focused on managing assets, having a council now that is focused on you know, essentially expediting you know, the broader governance, right? Because for instance, like there's plenty of token holders that I think want to vote but don't necessarily want to sit here and look at minute decisions, and you know, that just creates a lot of noise, and then it creates a lot of pressure on all the token holders. Where in this, you know, in this situation, what we're doing is empowering a body that has a check on the team, has a check on the Treasury Council, and you know, as you start to build those systems out, like you really do start to see real decentralization where they're all doing their own things, but then they're all checking in on each other and making sure that there's like no abuses going on.
Yeah, I agree. And like the interesting challenge, I think, will become coordination, right? So like right as you have more of these entities that are doing their different things and are checking on each other, right? You depending on how independent they are, right? You then start to run into like coordination challenges of how do you like line up work, or how do you get that to work, right? And then, you know, I'm just thinking about this in the future, right? But then you kind of see that like then maybe you need other organizations that are focused on coordination, right? So I do think, yeah, it really is just like about taking where we're already at, which is I actually think pretty far, right? And continuing to like kind of dissect what an organization is, and figure out how to like deal with these problems in like new and decentralized ways, right? That like create like a more durable organization without somebody in control, like maintain custody in a way that like is very different from like what we see in the world now, and like brings forward like concepts of the future of work.
Yeah, I also think you know, governance 2.0 in my mind goes even further than Badger, right? I mean, if you look at what we've been doing recently in the Balancer Aura ecosystem, that requires a lot of, you know, dealing with their governance, right? So you know, I see DeFi as becoming this sort of like, you know, amalgamation of different protocols that are all sort of tied together through governance. And you know, we had, you know, this example of like Hash Error, who went and wrote his own balancer proposals, and even got a bit of like pushback from specific members of the team, right? Being like, oh, well, we're working on this other thing, you know, I'm not telling you not to go do that, but it's not necessarily what we're focused on. And then the council got involved, right? Like the council had to, oh, of course, Hash Error joins right after I start talking about him. But yeah, the council had to go and make some decisions around how are we gonna move inside of the the Balancer ecosystem, and then the Treasury Council had to make some decisions around how we're gonna move inside of the Balancer ecosystem, and then the team had to make, so in my mind, it was a very successful display of the system working in a decentralized way with these different governing bodies, like all sort of, interacting with each other in what I think was a very successful way.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, you're right, and that's really cool.
So 1500, you were mentioning that obviously like BIP 93 is not the end of governance 2.0, and it's kind of this ongoing process. So I'm curious to get everyone's take as to what is the next major piece that we kind of need to chunk out as the next BIP that BIP builds into this. I think Tritium, one area that you were mentioning was the kind of like where is the line between a smaller scope decision that the council can make versus the requiring of a full BIP line. I think that's something that's very important, like to as we scope out these checks and balances and where the kind of clear dividing lines lie. And we've already done that with the Treasury BIP, but like in terms of changing the tokenomics or grants or all this kind of stuff, like do you think that's kind of the logical next step, or is there another area that we can that would be more useful to work on right now?
I mean, you mentioned me, so I'll start, and then I'm interested to see what other people think. But I personally think that if it were up to me, I think there's two deliverables that I would like to see out of the council next, right? Like, one is like on our website, like a revision of our documentation about the governance process, right? So one thing is the entire BIP process, like how we make decisions, like even just the token holder governance process. But to go really revise that, write that, make sure we agree. I don't know if that needs to be a BIP or not. Like, I think a lot of it's kind of already there, but we just need to make that like very clear and crisp, and somebody needs to own that and make sure that like we keep that up to date, and that like the information about our governance process is living. So I think that's one deliverable. And then yeah, the other deliverable is about thinking just generally about authority, right? Like, what are the boundaries of authority? What does the team decide? What does the council decide? What does the Treasury Council decide? What do the token holders decide? Like, are there other things that need to be decided? Like, I think gravity creates some situations where maybe you already need some different bodies that have like specialized skills that need some autonomy, right? So like, how do you get that structure together? Um, and how do you like modify that? How does that structure, like, what are the steps to like change that, or to like change those bodies? And I kind of see that then is the next BIP, right? So I think there's a BIP around authority, and like some like documentation and just clean up around like process transparency.
Yeah, I think there's actually a role that isn't filled, I would say, across all of DeFi, but more specifically to Badger here in our conversation is we really just need the person that is sort of like a lawyer for DeFi, where they will go and spend all of the time reading through all of the past BIPs, through all of the Treasury decisions, through all of the council decisions, and essentially memorize all of it and be the expert on holding everyone true to their own words, right? Like, um, most of the council's power, as far as I've been able to figure out, has just come through precedent, right? Which, I mean, that speaking of precedent, like that's what most modern governments use, right? Is they say, oh, we don't have a law, but there was a court case and it was settled in this way. So most of the council's power at the moment are simply from, well, they did it in the past, so they can do it in the future, right? So I do think that there's two things that need to happen. Is kind of what Tritium was talking about, is like we need to cap that power in some way, and then we also really need some person or multiple people that are willing to take that dive in and become, in my mind, it's a bit tedious work, but maybe not more tedious than writing code, but becoming this sort of expert of DeFi, and if that person were to go even further outside of Badger DAO and be able to bring to Badger precedents from other DAOs and that sort of thing, I think that's just a really powerful position that could really, really positively impact the DAO.
agree. And I think the reality is it will more likely be a person at first. But again, the more people, right, the more that is decentralized, the more people that are involved in that actively, the better.
So I want to kind of take a moment to put forth a plug for something that I'm working on, and I think maybe could be or should be included as part of this governance 2.0, and that is a forward-looking statement or terms of service as regards to risk and loss events on Badger. So obviously, we had the December exploit, and now in the last week or two, there's been a request that was initiated by Spada to, have the governance consider reimbursing losses that happened on the Bitcoin bridge. And it just occurs to me that, with the restitution process that 1500 and Tritium and Lip and everyone else has been working on, like we are establishing that has established a precedent for how Badger responds to events like this, and this bridge is establishing another precedent, and those past processes have always been gone through a bit process. And I'm concerned that it creates, if there were to be future loss events, that we don't have kind of a policy in place that is already kind of enshrined by a bit for what happens in cases like this, right? So like the bridge thing was quite minor, but what if it had been 10 or 100 times bigger? That would be basically catastrophic. So I think since we've established the process with restitution, getting some kind of a governance past user agreement, either a user at your own risk, or a Badger will use its token to backstop, or whatever forward-looking policy on this. I think that just kind of like goes to the core of what it means to be a DeFi protocol, and something that we should take a look at, especially now given bear market, treasury, where it is, and I just think like it goes to the core of the protocol, and better to think about it and prepare for the worst, but before we're kind of like left to potentially have like another ad hoc situation. So I'll just throw that out there. I have a draft in progress, and I'm took a little extra time because I'm going through and looking at other loss events in DeFi and seeing kind of like what the common precedents are. But like going to 1500, I think we would absolutely need to kind of have a legal advisory for the DAO on this, and think about how everything comes together.
Well, that's super interesting, right? So like what you echoed in a million different directions, a million's a lot, but in many different directions, like, yeah, like we have some precedent or no precedent, right? And it's like, I look at different things all the time and I'm like, yeesh, like we should really just get this written down. And so I think what you're talking about is amazing, because I actually think that's what we want, right? We want generally people in the community that care about something to go and do the hard work and put together, like a proposal that is good and seems right. And then we want that to come to the council, right, which has, has this process in mind, is focused on this stuff. And if you look at BIP 93, like also has a reasonable budget, right, to bring in a lawyer, to bring in, to work with the team or outside the team to like bring in whatever resources need to happen to get that done. So like I think it's great what you're doing, and get it together and bring that to the council. And I think like trying to get that done, like that's a pretty complex, like heavy thing that like touches in a lot of areas, right? And like if we can figure out how to do that well through this council process, like that would be huge.
I think actually, Lip, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just echo a lot of the same sentiment that I think ultimately, Wasabi, that's a great exercise. But at the same time, what are you trying to do, right? You're trying to protect users, and you're also trying to limit liability across the DAO. And that's a hard question to answer, right? Like this is a very innovative way for a business to operate. But I think there's also a lot of clarity that the industry at this stage is starting to figure out, because even stuff that say blue chips were doing a year ago compared to now on how to protect liability and users, it's changing and it's evolving, right? And it's a moving target that's really hard to land on. But I think a lot of the common themes that we're talking about here make a lot of sense, right? When you have like people on this call right now are taking an active, participation role, whereas the vast majority of token holders are more passive. So there's a lot of similarities there in being a member-based entity or a member-based association. So then if you're going down that path, you start to have to think about similar to some of the checks and balances and some of the definitions of roles in that actual bit, as an example, to step back and think about how decisions are made. You then have to actually document like articles of an association, right, to build that out, describe and define the bodies that are involved that a few people have mentioned, describe and define, how members and token holders are included in the different bodies and the different layers of, I guess, like membership, if you will. And then that chunks back to how decisions are made, how liability is protected. But then also, I think it's really important that can evolve, right? Like, as I mentioned, this is a lot of moving target stuff that no one in the world really knows how to solve, including the highest levels of like governments, right? In trying to regulate and understand the space. Because not only is it really innovative and volatile and fast on the tech and on, the tokens, it's also a completely different way to operate, in quotes, like a business, if you will. So that's some of my perspective on it. I think that the overall space is maturing a bit. There's also more heat and more pressure coming from, the largest regulators, and also some precedent, like we're talking about, from Badger's behavior, but also other protocols, and then also some, large capital allocators that are somewhere in between are trying to figure it out. And as a result, that's showing some new precedent that people can learn from.
Yeah, I actually think that this is an opportunity for us to be a leader because, what I personally experienced around the Badger restitution from last, December going into January was there was a lot of community talk about what had been done with other protocols. And then it turns out, these were things like ICE, which was led by Danny and Sifu, and they were like, oh, we're just going to pump infinite money into this, and it ended up being like not the best thing for their users, right? And there's all these protocols over the last year, let's call it, that have essentially paid out to their users because they had, let's just call it infinite capital, basically like more capital than was at risk. But in my mind, like this is literally infinite risk, right? There's known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. And I think what this is protecting against is that, those unknown unknowns and those known unknowns. Basically, things can happen. We don't know what will happen. We know that they can happen, and I think it's actually a terrible look, like across all of DeFi, if you're just going to keep saying that all these unprecedented things happen and we're just going to keep paying out, right? Because that's just a bad proposition, right? That's just going to end up with everybody losing all of their money over time, and all of the, I mean, you're basically just like promoting hacking, right? You're just promoting people to go do bad things because all the users are going to get paid out, and it's going to be figured out. I think, yeah, Badger could be a really strong leader in the space, and maybe in the beginning it's a little bit frowned upon because people want to just have their money paid back to them. But I don't, there's nothing else in the world. I mean, look at the examples right now with 3AC and Celsius and Voyager and whatever. They needed bailouts, or some of them are filing for bankruptcy. And this is just like an evolving new space with lots of risks that everyone's taking. And I think the users should be a lot more aware of those risks. And if you create this precedent that they can just get bailed out with whatever they do, then you create a whole community of users that are not discretionary, right? They're not taking time to figure out what is the best way to invest their money in DeFi. They're just throwing their money around expecting to get paid out if they can get hacked,
Yeah, I agree. Like with like let's just talk about Terra for a second, for example. But like the 20% yields on stable coins, right? Like any experienced investor says, well, like there has to be risk, right? Like if there wasn't risk, then like it is priced in. So the reality is that like when you are investing, you are taking risk, right? And so like when you're investing in a yield protocol, you're taking like some risk like for those yields, right? That's kind of when you're investing in a stable coin Ponzi scheme, you're taking like some risk for those yields, like whatever you're doing, that's the situation. And so fundamentally, what happens in these like restitution things is that like an event happens that somehow affects some or all holders in a different way, right? Or maybe all the same way, and then you're somehow like socializing all of those losses, right? And so the conversation about like as an association, as a DAO, as a community, right? Like how much do we all want to like chip in to try to kind of like lighten the burden on like the people that were unlucky or that like suffered an event, right? And were like more exposed to this risk, which was extreme in the Badger situation, right? In terms of just that imbalance, right? Like that's one conversation, but somehow this idea that like everybody's going to get paid back, like that's a big jump, right? Like no, it's like there's risk and like money was lost, and it's probably going to come from somewhere eventually, right? And the question is more like where is it coming from? And I think that's a good conversation, but I agree that the expectations like are a little bit off, and in the end like they don't come true, right? So it's not like like that is what actually generally ends up happening. And so I think figuring out how to like and I agree it won't always be a popular conversation, but figuring out how to get that right and have like more mature conversations about that is really good.
So Freddie just joined us. If I would love to take a step back now, back to the actual BIP that was recently passed around on council, and maybe you could give us, as the writer of the BIP, just some summary of your thoughts about it, and intentions and where you see things going.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming in clear for
Yep.
me.
Okay, good. Yeah, so thanks for giving me a little time here. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we're trying to solve for with that BIP. And the first is about community engagement. And there's two aspects to that, right? One is, we in a prior BIP had elected the council, and the council is primarily from the community and people who have a track record and a history of engagement. And so there was a need for some additional structure, right, around the council, what the expectations from the core team and the community were for the council, and the boundaries and guidelines for how it would operate. And then there's also a desire to get more engagement from the broader community. We've heard a lot about people wanting to know how do they bring a BIP forward? How do they get it posted in the forum? How long does it take to get it approved? Right, that's something that we've really struggled with, and so we tried to put some structure around that as well. So those are the two main components of Council 2.0. How do we get the community engaged? How do we help them and facilitate them in bringing BIPs forward? And what are some of the operating guidelines around the council? And then, the third leg of that stool is changing the forum voting process, or I guess clarifying the forum voting process so that it is a signaling activity. And what we mean by signaling is it's an opportunity for people who aren't fully engaged in Discord but are on the forum to provide feedback to ideas, and to make that something that's time bound rather than vote bound. So, the previous mechanics of voting where you need a quorum 26 of 50, which during a bull market it's easy to accomplish. During a bear market, it's hard to meet that threshold. And what that means is that really good ideas get stuck in the forum and can't proceed to a snapshot, right, to an on-chain vote. So what we did is we created a role for the council to help facilitate bringing BIPs forward, getting them posted on the forum so that members of the community have people that they can engage with and a clear path for bringing those forward. And then we lowered the threshold, or changed the threshold, I guess, so that it's one of getting feedback on the forum, and then incorporating that, getting additional feedback if necessary, and then asking the council to weigh in on, is that ready for a snapshot vote? Does it have the apparent support from within the community, and has it incorporated all of the community feedback? And what that'll do is it'll allow us to get to an on-chain vote with good ideas, not necessarily being bottlenecked, right, in a bear market when we can't get enough engagement. So I'm gonna pause right there and ask if there's any questions from anybody who's on the call just about that piece.
One thing, Freddie, that jumps out to me, and great work on bringing this forward, is you're describing a lot of the balance of, say, efficiency versus decentralization and the spectrum to build that. And I think that's a really hard problem, right? Like, that's something that requires new ways of thinking about how all of the information flows for people to be informed on making decisions. And then, to your point, some of the tactics to actually make sure it moves through either a yes, a no, a rework in a reasonable amount of time, right? To your point, if something's just sitting there collecting dust for a month, the entire objective that bit was trying to solve may have to be rethought about again. If that's just not rational, right, on moving the DAO forward. So I think you bring up a really good point on that.
Yeah, and we could, like, even if this hadn't passed, at least if we could have gotten to a no, right? But we couldn't get to a yes or no. It was
right.
just stuck.
You're just in limbo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in limbo. And I think you made a really good point that it's a spectrum, right? Decentralization is a spectrum, and the goal is to make sure that the DAO can move forward and can implement changes and to find the right balance there. And so I think that's a great segue into the third part of this BIP, which is around checks and balances. So the first thing I'd say is this is a starting point. It's not intended to be the finish. And so the goal is to do course corrections as we see what works and what doesn't. And some of those course corrections could involve the council, right? Like, if the community or the core team doesn't believe that the council is performing or holding up their responsibility to adequately represent the interests of the community, there are mechanisms for the council to be thrown out by the community or by the core team. And that was really important to put those checks and balances in, because we realized that as we moved away from that original quorum, we needed to be cautious and guarded about potentials for abuse there, right? So the checks and balances are in place to make sure that if the community or the core team feels that the council is misbehaving in any way, they can be replaced. And that's at an individual or a kind of a complete council level. And then, the final thing that is in the BIP is around compensation for the council. So, it's one thing to have community members who, and here's the irony of it, I'm late to this meeting, but who just kind of pop in ad hoc as they can and as time allows, versus people who are really fully engaged in driving things forward. And that requires a different level of commitment. And so, I want to kind of thank the core team, and especially Tritium, for proposing that there's some financial incentives for the council engagement, and at different levels, right? So there's, a kind of a core council level, and then there's a committee council level, with the committee council level being one that's probably more fully engaged, similar to the way that I've been and a number of the other members of the council have been, in terms of writing BIPs, really engaging with the community, helping to drive new ideas forward, coming up with new ideas. And then there's a role of chair badger, which we're going to leave, I think, unfilled for the time being, which is really around somebody who's going to be the whip and the coordinator between the core team and the council for really pushing and driving and being more aggressive around moving things forward. Anybody from the council or Tritium, anybody else want to kind of weigh in on aspects of BIP 93 that I haven't covered? Any other comments from the community?
I had just one thing that occurred to me as I was kind of going back and looking at the stuff before this call, and that is the vote threshold. So like I was just going back and seeing how many votes the last few BIPs got, and there's really a wide range in this in BIP 93, which is actually like probably the most important BIP that we've done in a long time. It got 80,000 votes, which is actually below the threshold in that BIP. So the threshold in the BIP is 100,000 votes for the snapshot to be effective. So I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts on that. Do we think this might need to be tweaked downward, or is this just kind of an outlier? Or any thoughts around the threshold number there?
I have a thought, Wasabi. Along those lines, I think it's really important to really drive a collective of as many wallet holders as possible participating in votes, similar to what Freddie was talking about around just community engagement, because it's way more powerful to have, you know, 1,000 wallets vote on something to get a clearer picture of what that consensus is than say 3 large holders. And what's been good, if you take a look back, and I think someone mentioned, analyzing some of the precedent or some of the participation since Badger's inception, what you can see is that each proposal, for the most part, has represented, you know, dozens and hundreds of unique wallets representing thousands of tokens allocated against those votes. And then on aggregate against all of the BIPs, millions of votes through tokens have been cast. So I think ultimately that threshold has to be thought through. To your point, Wasabi, does it make sense to have just a hard number like that 100K, or is it more just around time parameters like Freddie's saying, or just certain levels of engagement and participation from like a non-wallet volume point of view?
And I'll chime in on that too. So I raised the 100,000 vote threshold, and um, one of the things I did when I joined the council is I went back and I looked through all of the BIPs, not just the ones that got the snapshot, but the ones that hit the forum, looking for the guardrails for both snapshot votes and for forum votes. And what I discovered, and if somebody knows something that I've missed, please speak up. But a lot of what's there it has been adopted as a guideline, and it's become sort of the canon of the land, right? Almost urban legend. So, like, I couldn't find 100,000 as the hard non. I couldn't find 50 votes as in something that was in a BIP in the forum. It's something that was kind of adopted as a good standard along the way, as best as I can tell. And I think it's worthwhile having this conversation. Like, right? Do we want to formalize that? Do we want to, have it cast in stone? Do we want something else? It's a great conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree, Freddie, that it's a moving target, right? Like all of this stuff is innovative, and what works now isn't going to work in the future in some regards. So how do you be agile? How do you let it live and breathe based on some of the precedent that we're talking about, but then also some of the innovation that you're seeing across the space? And that's also when I think about just some of the liability and some of the legal risk that's associated with this kind of stuff. No one has all the answers. So you can have some directional understanding against moving targets, but then also you have to have the ability to live and breathe and reevaluate and evolve. And I think that Badger's done a good job at that. And that has to continue with this type of conversation and the progression that's coming through, from the upgraded council and people putting more eyes and more focus on this type of problem.
Yeah,
And guys,
I
if I
just.
can,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think, not having that foundational framework and precedent in place before important things happen, or not everything, every BIP's important, every governance decision is important, but we saw with restitution in particular, with the Sybil attacks on the forum and just having this arbitrary 50 vote number that one, to Freddie, your point, was really kind of picked out of a hat. And then two, when there was something that happened that technically, like, there was like 100 votes or whatever, but they were all no, like there really wasn't any precedent around what to do there. And then all of a sudden, we're starting to scramble as a community and as a group, trying to figure out the the direction to take because there hasn't been precedence, and then all of a sudden you're walking on pins and needles because there's so much at stake versus having those things in place well before anything happens, and then being able to talk about it and discuss it without, you know, enormous pressure or certain circumstances where bias could be looked at as part of it. We can always reference the decisions that were made and the guardrails and the framework or parameters, more in particular, that were in place well before, you know, a vote arises. So I think it's a very important conversation, something honestly that we haven't spent enough time figuring out over the last couple years. And I don't think it's, you know, it's that difficult of a thing to figure out, or at least set that baseline for. It just hasn't been put as a priority for a very long time.
Yeah, I was just gonna make a pretty philosophical point that you know, this is just like a hard problem, right? I think it is a problem that has existed for thousands of years, if not more. Trying to figure out, you know, how to govern in a fair way, right? And it does come down to complexities of math, right? You pick a number and then you realize, oh, you know, we chose this based on some factors that have changed. So yeah, I just want to reiterate that this is a moving process, and it's I think one of the most interesting and challenging problems like across humanity. And I'm very excited to be involved, and I think a lot of people come to the DAO for that reason. That you know, this is sort of like a breakthrough in governance and an experiment in governance.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody. I mean, I really enjoyed kind of working on a number of these BIPs, and I just hope that everybody feels like we're getting the right results. And I have a lot of faith both in the council and the core team and the rest of the community that, you know, whatever mid-course corrections we need along the way, we'll make. I think there's a good conversation for us to have around this 100,000 vote threshold, right? And what makes sense in a fair market.
Yeah, I mean, Freddie, I feel incredibly good about how things are going, right? Like we've been trying to move governance forward for almost a year now. And so like I'm like super stoked about this BIP. I think we've got like a good council. I think we're seeing like more engagement. Hopefully, like this pay structure will help there be more. And like, yeah, like it's time to do it. And I'm really happy that like that, yeah, that you are on top of it and that our whole council's on top of it, right? And that we've got the right people there that are that I actually think are like able to start figuring this out with us and bring it forward.
Yeah, and you know, I just want to say too that don't forget that the next council election is coming up September 30th, so it's not that far off. And certainly, you know, we encourage anybody who wants to be involved to raise their hand.
I was
So
gonna say, you know, for those that are on Google Meet meetings with me, I like to raise my hand all the time. Unfortunately, there is no raising hand function here on Discord, so I can't do that.
Yeah.
So we're almost at an hour, but maybe we can try to put a bow on this with some kind of like next steps. What think I'm hearing is the next two BIPs. So number one, you know, BIP 93 revised the structure. Now we do have this 100K threshold that was put in there. But it sounds like the kind of next major piece of governance too is a BIP that I guess you could call like checks and balances, deep dive. So that kind of goes even further into this level of detail around like what is the purview of the council, what decisions can the council make without getting a full BIP, and then also look into, you know, the 100K vote threshold, what makes sense, how could we elasticize that if needed. I don't see it, you know, under the BIP 93, I don't see an elastic a way that can be elastic. So I think that next BIP would need at least 100K votes, at least the way I'm reading it. And then number two would be this other piece around a user agreement. And thankfully BIP 93 has a budget as part of this budget that Freddie mentioned, has lawyer money or expert money. So I assume legal counsel would fit under that purview, that we can really take this to get full advice and come to some kind of like a pre-authorized statement about the risks and how it would work in like any other loss events that might take place.
Yeah, thanks. So I just made a note of all that. So checks and balances, you said, especially with regards to what can be decided by the council, where those guardrails are, the 100K threshold, and how to think about that going forward, and then also doing a kind of a legal risk assessment and finding a way to articulate Badger's responsibility for loss events. Does that summarize it?
Yep. And I have a document in progress on that second piece. I'm happy to help with the first, and we can kick drafts around. But we will be having these discussions in the council governance channel on Discord. And yeah, I would just echo what Freddie said. If anyone wants to get involved, either as part of the council with elections coming up or just in general, hit us up on the Discord. I think, like Tridium said, like bear market leaves like only the you can get a lot more work done, more people are there's less noise, and so I think I'm excited to make some good progress on these issues and keep driving forward. So thanks everyone for coming today. We'll have these recordings up, and Badger on.